Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Wire. I thought really compelling discussion for you today with an author of a book about disabilities, and I think it's going to be very interesting. Adelle Purdham is the author's name. She's an educator. She's a parent disability advocate, and she's the author of a memoir in essays called "I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself," which was named in the fall of 2024 as the most anticipated memoir and biography by Indigo and 49th Shelf. Her prose and poetry appear in literary journals, anthologies, magazines, newspapers, and online. Adelle's essays are finalists in several literary contests, including the Writers Union of Canada Short Prose Competition, Event Magazine, and the Fiddlehead Creative Nonfiction Contest. Adelle is a sessional course instructor at Trent University, where she teaches creative writing. She lives and writes in her hometown of Peterborough, Ontario. Adelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for having me. I should clarify, I don't think it was the most anticipated book, but I think it was one of their on that list of anticipated books for chapters.
That's, you know
That would
what,
be
in in
something.
in the current environment of politics, it's so refreshing to have someone fact check themselves. So thank you for that clarification. I really appreciate it. So I don't do disability and other lies I've told myself. What's it about?
Yeah. So I would say in a line, the book is, well, it's my story as a mother to a daughter with Down syndrome, confronting my own ableism. And ableism, the way I kind of describe it is this belief that an abled body is better than a disabled body. Um, so that's sort of in a nutshell, but maybe I could tell you a little bit about the story behind the title. Would
Please.
that be okay?
Yes, please do so.
Yeah. So when I was when I was a teenager, before I really thought too much about Down syndrome and disability, um, I I was the kind of kid, had A's. I was a competitive gymnast. A lot of focus in my life probably on perfection from that angle of things. And I remember one day I was doing all this volunteer work. So, I was selling lollipops in my school, in my high school, to raise money for against child slavery in other parts of the world. I was cutting the lawns of seniors in my neighborhood. I was coaching school gymnastics teams, all of these different things. But one day, walking across my high school lawn, the thought occurred to me. I had this question, this nagging feeling. Why are you not volunteering with people with cognitive disabilities? And I just remember comforting myself and saying, that's okay. Like, as in, you're not a bad person. It's okay. You just don't do disability. I just don't do disability. And I kind of thought of disability at that time as if if I didn't get involved in that world, then disability couldn't touch me or those that I loved. And I really truly viewed it, I didn't have a problem with people with disabilities, but it wasn't, that wasn't me. And I thought I really viewed it as like a separate thing. And then fast forward until I had my first daughter when I was 27, my daughter Ariel, and then Elise, my daughter with Down syndrome, came along when I was 28 years old. And so enter Elise. And all of a sudden, this belief that I'd held about, disability sort of being a bad thing, and all these ideas I had, they could no longer hold because I couldn't reconcile the way I once thought about disability with this beautiful baby that I had in front of me. And so, and it was also this realization that I've come to now in this whole journey that I've been on. My daughter Elise is now 11, but this realization that disability is just part of the human condition, right? It's just part of who we are. We enter this world disabled, dependent on our mothers. We often leave this world. This is not my idea. I should give credit to Jean Vanier, but we often leave this world dependent on others. And disability can be viewed like more as a continuum. I've heard Amanda Leduc, disability activist, talk about this, that, sometimes for some people, they have permanent disabilities. For others, it can be temporary. And yeah, just sort of shifting. It's been a whole shift for me on what disability means. And so I guess that a lie that I told myself, that's sort of the biggest one in my book, that I don't do disability, like as if I have a choice, or as if it's a bad thing, and it's not, right? It's just part of who we are.
Many of us don't understand what it would be like to raise a disabled child, and or a child with Down syndrome, and would be scared, frankly, of that, and of our ability to actually deal with it. Can you share a little bit about your journey as a mother of a child with Down syndrome?
Hmm, that's a great question. I think initially for me, and not everyone goes through this experience differently. So I found out prenatally. I knew beforehand. We got a call from our midwife, and there had been it was called a soft marker for Down syndrome. She had a short nasal bone. And I guess there's over 120 soft markers for Down syndrome that they can see around your 20-week ultrasound. And so at the time, we did a follow-up blood test, and then we knew with a certain amount of, we knew with certainty pretty much before she was born. And the way that I deal with things is I go and read about them. And um, I guess one of the things that stood out to me right away, I remember walking into our local chapters, and there were no books, like no books on Down syndrome. And that really spoke volumes to me about, or at least it felt emblematic at the time of how society sort of treats people with disabilities. Like they're invisible. It felt like nobody cared, like it didn't matter. Um, and so I remember I wrote a letter. Can I talk to the manager? And I made a point of helping get some books in the store so that another parent wouldn't feel that way, the way I had felt. And I guess that was sort of the beginning of me thinking, I'm going to tell our story. Because then, so Down syndrome is not a medical condition in and of itself, but it's associated with a lot of medical concerns. Up to 50% of babies born with Down syndrome require heart surgery. Many have gastrointestinal issues. And so my daughter was very fortunate at birth that she didn't need heart surgery. But one of the benefits for us from knowing beforehand was that then they looked for all these other medical concerns, right? So they found that she had something called duodenal atresia, a blockage in the duodenum. And I've since done so much reading on just the history of how people with Down syndrome have been treated. And in the past, and I mean like 50 years ago, those babies would have been left to die. So they wouldn't have done the corrective surgery. So I guess it's important for me to share this kind of information because, like, what's it like for you to have the child with Down syndrome? It's like, it's never really Elise who is the issue or who brings kind of the emotional challenges. It's kind of navigating our society's ableism and navigating like the context that I'm bringing her up in, right? We're also coming out of at the same time that those babies were being left untreated. And thank God for the physicians who, did step in and said, like, no, this needs to change. And the parents. But I don't know if you can hear my budgie in the background. We just got this budgie yesterday. He showed up at our door. Sorry, random aside. Apparently he talks. Yeah, so I was saying about there was sort of this context of this surgery that my daughter ended up needing to save her life, finding out later like other babies would have died, right? And also knowing that people with Down syndrome were institutionalized and that parents used to be faced with this decision of, well, it wasn't even really a decision. It was framed by the medical community as the best thing for you is to not have this burden in your family. And so there's sort of these remnants of these feelings that even though our society has changed quite a bit, that still lingers. And so I write about that in some of my essays in the book. Reverberation of institutional violence is one of those essays where I talk about essentially the violence that I've seen in different forms, because there was some researchers who in like the 60s 70s, they went into institutions and they looked at the different types of violence that were happening, and they called it, sorry, I want to look up their names. I read about this in Shut Away, When Down Syndrome Was a Life Sentence, by Dr. Catherine McKersher. I just want to highlight that book. Excellent book about specifically Ontario's institutional past. But the researchers were Rossiter and Rinaldi, and they talked about cold violence, warm violence, and hot violence. And I think you could, if you've heard about what went on in institutions, like, you know, we can go from something like a slap in the face, or to rape, you know, or hosing people down, these types of dehumanizing practices. So I guess for me, learning about that was important in terms of understanding some of the things that I've seen happen with my own daughter. So I've written about that to sort of process it.
So
But
tell us a little bit
yeah,
about life with your own daughter. You know, lots of us
yeah, sorry.
can't
I'm
imagine
co-
what it would be like. Tell us.
yeah,
Share.
so yeah, for sure. So some days, um, some of the essays in my collection, I zoom in really close. So one of them in particular, I talk about, it's called The Giving Tree, and I'm the giving tree as a mother. And essentially, if you know the story of the giving tree, um, the tree sort of gives everything of herself until and the child keeps taking until there's nothing left. And I think all children do this to an extent. So part of what I want to say about parenting a child with a disability for me, um, a lot of it's like parenting any child, but then there's the added, if your child has medical concerns, then you're kind of dealing with those. If um okay, I'm a former teacher, so I have a pretty good understanding of the education system, but I also have had to try to navigate that, like trying to um find a place for trying to help them understand my daughter and how best to teach her has been a real challenge. Um, but for me, I mean, it's your child, so you just any other kid, I guess, but with these societal challenges of like, yeah, navigating the health system, the healthcare system, if that's something you need to do. And we've had amazing experiences there, but not everybody does, right? Not every physician delivers that news in a way that's um, sensitive and compassionate, and um, doesn't put negative connotations into the diagnosis. Um, and then there's navigating the school system, as I mentioned, and that, I guess, just it takes time. It
I think
does.
it
I
must
don't
take
want to
a
shy away
huge
from the
amount of effort.
real, well, yes, but it isn't but I guess that's just your life,
Did
right?
you
And anything can
did you
happen
did
with
you
anyone at any time, I
did you
guess.
cons did you consider terminating the pregnancy when you heard the news?
Yeah, so interesting. My husband and I, when we were dating, we met walking our dogs. Okay. So we met on these dog walks. I would walk one block, he would walk the other block, and we would kind of cross in the middle, and that kept happening. And then he was like, hey, you know, do you want to walk dogs with me? And on those dog walks, before we ever had children or got married, we talked about, we talked about so many things. And I remember having a conversation pregnant. And he was like, okay. Like, well, I would, I would look after you. And I said, okay, what if the baby had special needs? Okay. I don't really use that term anymore, but at the time, that's what I said. What if the baby had special needs? And I kind of held my breath. I just remember thinking, like, oh, what if we don't agree on this? And he had said to me, well, it would be our baby, wouldn't it? And I was like, yeah, it would be. So then fast forward, I don't even know how many years later, 4 or 5 years later, when we're pregnant with our daughter with Down syndrome. And that is one of the questions that at the time, I'm not sure if it's still the same, but 11 years ago, that the pediatrician asked. Sorry, not pediatrician, obstetrician. She said, okay, I have to ask this. Do you want to move forward with the pregnancy? Because if you don't, you only have kind of so much time. And I remember just sort of putting my hand on my husband's lap and really having this moment of like, oh my God, what if he's changed his mind? Because inside me, I could feel my baby, and she felt the same as my other baby. And I could feel her moving, and I was attached to her, and I loved her the same. I felt like I loved her the same as my first daughter. So it didn't really change anything for me. And of course, he was like, no, of course, we wouldn't consider that. And in the years since, I've thought about that moment many times, and how we're both educated professionals, my husband and I. And I think about, we were able to find information on our own. And I feel like there has been a push in recent years for delivering more balanced information in those situations, because many parents, myself included, would want to talk to families and say, like, hey, you can do this. Like, this is going to, I guess I've talked about quite a few of the challenges, but there's so much goodness that my daughter has brought to my life, and that people with Down syndrome bring to the world, right? They aren't here to teach us something. I don't think that's fair to put on anyone, but there is something inside us when someone's brain works differently, and they have to learn to navigate the world, and we have to learn how to navigate that world with them. And that does something for us, I think, from an empathy standpoint, that's essential, right? Difference is important. And even biologically, difference is important. That's like how we survive as a species, is by having diversity. So yeah, I'm not sure if I finished that thought, but oh yeah, just to finish, I think would parents not be outraged if they were just carrying a pregnancy and there was nothing medically wrong with the baby? Like Down syndrome, really, there's nothing medically wrong. They have an extra copy of the 21st chromosome. And so they have extra genetic material, and it does cause some confusion at the cellular level. But otherwise, there's really tons of kids. I know many fully functioning who have no medical concerns. So imagine if a doctor asked a mother carrying, or set of parents carrying a typical child, and said, would you like an abortion? I think people would be friggin' outraged. I think they would sue that doctor. So I mean, I don't really understand. I guess I still am just not on board with that question for a woman who is vulnerable in that moment. I don't think it's the right one. I think that there needs to be a different way to have, I mean, I will say again, I've had this conversation with a physician, educated professionals. My husband and I'm privileged in that way. I'm in a partnership. I have support. I have resources. I understand that that's not going to be the case for every family, but that's where I think society needs to step in, right? We need to look after each other. I think this idea of our interconnectedness, both to each other and the natural world, I think is really at the core of my book, and what I'm trying to say, and what I've learned from having my daughter.
Sounds like a fascinating book. Tell us, remind us what the name of it is.
It's called I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with our author, Adelle Purdham. I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Adelle Purdham. She is the author of a book of essays called I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself. And we've been having I think a really frank and honest and interesting conversation about disability and her daughter's Down syndrome. Why is it other lies I've told myself?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've had this question. I had this question from, agents and other publishing professionals. They said when I was first pitching the book, they kind of had those who had read it. And I think this is actually important to mention for those in the disability community who think that this is going to be just my story about Elise and I and about my journey as a mother to a child with Down syndrome and only really focus on that. There's, okay, it is that's the core of the book. But I guess I had this feeling that I am more than just a mother to a child with Down syndrome. And so it was important for me to be somewhat, to present, to be kind of countercultural and go against stereotypes and say, like, because I do think there's a stereotype that if you're a mother to a child with a disability, then that's all that you are, right? That's who you are. That's your identity. And you can't have a life. And I think that's completely false. And I've always wanted to push back against that notion that I can only be one thing, and that anyone is one thing. The same with the way that I want to push back in this book about stereotypes about people with Down syndrome. So I write about my marriage. I write about female friendship. I write about becoming a writer. And in that way, I hope kind of flesh myself out on the page.
What do you write about your marriage?
Well, I guess I felt like you needed to understand who my husband's Dan. You needed to understand who Dan and I were as people, right? To understand, I guess, where I'm coming from and some of the things I want to say about Down syndrome. But I also wanted to, I have one essay called Extramarital Sex, like where I really get into some of my desires or my thoughts and fantasies that you might like. I kind of like this idea of pairing like conversations about sex with Down syndrome, because I do think that just in most people's minds does not go together. But I wanted to show us struggle. I wanted to be honest about the struggles in our marriage through the pandemic, for example. So one of my essays, it's called A Loon. We bought a cottage at the beginning of the pandemic and thought this was going to be an idyllic escape. Before, I guess in 2019, and sort of the last essay in my book, I talk about we had sold our home and moved into a more economical home, and we traveled the world for 6 weeks with our 3 kids. Penelope was then 3, my youngest daughter. I think Elise and Ariel were like 7 and 8. I think Elise turned 7 in Thailand. So, but we did like this kind of around the world trip. So we were doing all this traveling, and then, okay, now boom, it's a pandemic. The traveling's over. Let's get a cottage. So we moved there, and I just remember, so my husband works in kind of the pharmaceutical industry, and he's often on calls he's basically on calls all the time in meetings with colleagues or with physicians often. So he's on calls with physician. We're in this one room space. I'm doing my master's and trying to concentrate trying to write this book. And, Elise, my daughter with Down syndrome, is streaking naked behind his video calls with physicians. My other daughter, who's 3, is out on the teetering on the edge of the dock. And it's like, who's watching her? Who's responsible? And it just gave me a lot to write about. And also this situation ended up causing a lot of turmoil in our marriage. And then it caused me to sort of question, well, what do you do when a marriage breaks down, right? Is love supposed to last forever? Or what happens when it doesn't? Or like, what do you do? And so, one of my essays, How to Make New Love, is sort of an exploration of that and like how we did then build things back up. And
So your
I
marriage
think
did
other,
break down. You had some challenges, but
yeah, it absolutely did break down because it was just with no support during the pandemic. I guess all the things that we sort of relied on, and even my husband used to travel for work. So all of a sudden it was sort of this drowning in each other, right? And I think a lot of parents is like experienced this um, during the pandemic. When I remember meeting up with other parents when the kids finally went back to school, um, and everyone just kind of looking at each other like, "Phew, we made it." Like it was so. I was writing this book through that time. I basically there was no way there was not going to be a problem in our marriage because basically I was home with my kids for 9 years. Um, I wrote during that time, but I was mostly at home looking after the kids. And it was sort of finally my turn. You know, I got into the MFA program at the University of King's College, and I was supposed to be doing that full time. All three of my kids were going to be in school, and my husband was going to kind of step it up on the domestic front, and he did. He tried, but then all of a sudden, all three kids were home, and so yeah, it caused some turmoil in our marriage. And that, I wrote this book largely during my master's. It was
how,
my project.
how did
And
you
yeah,
fix things? How did you get back together?
yeah, we didn't actually break up. I should be clear about that. We just like lost each other. We stopped being able to communicate in a way that was helpful. So we're both generally really good communicators with each other. And we also have like a really good intimacy. So I think what I write about, what we eventually ended up doing, it was just a slow thing over time. It was sort of like try to give each other this space that we can each get what we need, which was truly just some space, right? Some space to breathe. And it was like once the kids went back to school and we didn't constantly feel like we were failing. Because with the three kids home, my oldest could manage, but my daughter with Down syndrome needed one-on-one. Our youngest needed one-on-one. She was in kindergarten, and no one was getting what they needed, right? So I guess, well, I will mention there was one particular questionnaire that I write about. It's called How to Fall in Love with, I think it's called How to Fall in Love with Anyone, or so How to Make Anyone Fall in Love with You. And it was an article in the New York Times, Modern Love by Mandy Lynn Catron. And so we did this. We sat together and we did this love questionnaire. I think it was probably like September, the kids went back to school that year. December, we did the questionnaire. And that did bring us closer. Reminded me of all the endearing qualities that things that I love about my husband, like that he's loyal to our family. And yeah, so I recommend that if anyone's having
Having some
like a
challenges.
little bit of a rough spot. Yeah.
I have a really good friend by the name of Tracy Schmidt, and she was born with no arms and no legs. And she's gone on to be a sailor and a climber and a skier and live this unbelievably interesting life. And she's a motivational speaker. Um, but she has no arms and no legs. She's called a four-limb quadriplegic, even though she never had anything amputated. It was things that she lost. And it's really made me think a lot about disability and frankly about abortion. And her attitude is, thank God I wasn't aborted. That so many people would have if they had that news done something. How do you think about this issue that really is front and center in the U.S. election right now?
Hmm. Well, I think it's always wise to talk to the individuals who have lived experience. Like you just mentioned, your friend. I think that's so wise. And I've had the great pleasure of going to several World Down Syndrome Congresses around the world. The very first one I went to was when Elise was about 18 months old, the World Down Syndrome Congress in India. And I remember hearing self-advocate Sherry Bernard, a woman with Down syndrome, speak about this exact topic. And Sherry Bernard, to give you some background information, she's South African. She was named Woman of the Year for becoming the first qualified teacher in the world with Down syndrome. And I remember meeting her, and she's about my age. And I remember meeting her and her mother out in the hallway, and her mom said to me, Adele, you've got to come listen to Sherry speak. And I went to that conference thinking, I have something to offer people with Down syndrome, and I'm going to come back and share all this information with the people back home. And in the end, it was like I had so much more to learn from them than I had to teach anyone, right? So I go into the room and I'm sitting there, and Sherry Bernard starts telling her story. And she speaks beautifully, and she's eloquent, and she's captivating. And all of a sudden she sort of says, people like me are aborted. And then she says, we deserve to live. And every time I say that and I remember that, I get goosebumps because she's right. And she was she's had like the fact she has to advocate for her own life. Like, I can't imagine what that's like to go through the world like that. It feels it's so wrong, and it's so unfair, right? That she has to do that. But hearing her say that, it was a moment I'll never forget.
Adele, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing us. Remind us the name of the book and where we can get it.
Yeah, the book is called I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself. It's available everywhere books are sold. I highly encourage you to visit your favorite indie bookstore, but Chapters and Amazon will do as well.
Adele, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We're going to take a break and come back with another story in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.